Yes, hello to you all out there again in vintage motorcycle land, and welcome back to your number one and favourite classic dirt bike TV, where of course we do try and rediscover more of those old school motocross machines from back in the day. Now we do have quite a lot of bikes and some racing still to get through before the end of the 2022 racing season, and of course after all the racing's done and dusted for this year, we will be bringing you more of those classic dirt bikes throughout the winter months. So if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, then I do hope you will take that opportunity to sign up before the end of the season. So right now we're going to take a look at an Evolution machine that is possibly one of the very best two-stroke motocross machines ever built by one of the Japanese racing factories. So right now let's dive straight into the video and take a look at this iconic 1983 CR480 Honda. Now, it's probably quite fair to say that the 1982 CR480 Honda was quite a decent bike, but in the following year, Honda then appeared to do what Meiko did with their fantastic 1981 490. They all of a sudden appeared to get all of their calculations absolutely spot on, and then Honda came out with a bike that is still regarded as one of the best open class two-strokers ever made, and we're talking about the mighty 1983 CR480 rocket ship. Now, our particular example of this iconic motocross machine, it belongs to Irishman Eric Bracewell, and Eric's only just recently purchased this bike to add to his off-road collection. Now, Eric told me that this bike's recently undergone a restoration by local bike builder Johnny Lusk, who has quite a reputation for the quality of his motocross bike restos. And it was also said that soon after Johnny had completed this bike, he was just struck by how well the bike had turned out, that he just couldn't bring himself to put this machine back on the track. But it's still a relatively stock original machine, although it does have replacement rental handlebars and of course an upgraded D&G exhaust system. But I'm sure you don't need me to tell you about just how fantastic these CR480s were. They were absolutely phenomenal race machines, because it was certainly the fastest and the best looking and lightest 500 that you could buy in 1983. But other bikes, like maybe the big YZ490 Yamaha, could certainly give this machine a run for its money in a straight line. But for flickability and handling, this Honda 480 was as sharp as a tack. And it's also well documented that these big 480s weighed less than some of the 250 bikes in 1983, and even although this was almost a full-blown 500, it still handled and turned like a 250, and at just 226 pounds in overall weight for an open class motocrosser, you can certainly understand why these were very much sought after motorcycles. Now, the bike's frame was made up of a tubular steel construction, but from 1983 Honda then gave the big 480 a removable subframe for the very first time. So as we move on to the big 480 two-stroke motor, which was a pretty simple design that had a 5-speed gearbox and a 6-pedal reed valve intake, and the fuel was fed into that cylinder normally by a 38mm key-in carburetor. But this motor here never had any of those fancy power valves or exhaust trickery to try and up the horsepower, because it didn't really need it, because in stock trim these 480s were pumping out around the 53 horsepower mark, which was still more than enough to rip your arms out of their sockets. And it was only really your top riders like the great Danny Magoo Chandler who could take these motors by the scruff of their necks and work them to 100% of their capacity. And with regards to the usable power of these awesome 480 engines, most of their best work was done in the bottom to mid-range area, and normally the best way to work the engine was to try and hold it in that sweet spot of the mid-range and then just short shift the gears, because as powerful as these motors were, there wasn't really much at the very top end, and as I said, these power plants had more than enough grunt for your average club rider to handle. And if you're one of those riders who's looking for big bore two-strokers to laze around the track on a Sunday afternoon, then this is probably not the bike for you, because these motors thrive on speed and they like to be worked hard. So if you're just a laid-back club rider who enjoy a stroll around the track on a Sunday afternoon, then it's probably best to look for something else, because these bikes are not for the faint of heart, and you have to have pretty big cojones to hold the throttle open in one of these rocket ships. Now, one of the little niggles on these engines, it said, was these kickstarters, which were set quite high up in the engine, and if you were a bit short in the leg department, it was quite awkward to try and get a decent kick at the motor. And these soft alloy levers were also prone to breaking at the knuckle if the engine kicked back. But of course, riders often swapped these alloy parts for the steel kicker from the early 1982 bike to try and solve that particular problem. But as I said, most of the parts on this 480 are original from 1983, although this exhaust expansion chamber here's a replacement D and G part, which is probably a much better quality pipe anyhow than the Honda original. And this nice alloy tailpipe is also another replacement part from the stock 1983 Honda original. And so as we move on to the front suspension on these 480s, which I think were normally 43mm Showa suspension units, and in normal race conditions these forks did work well enough, and they did give the rider around 12 inches of travel to play with at the front end. And surprisingly, these forks had, I think it was 14 compression damping adjustments as well, which was quite radical for its day. But having said that, these forks still did a decent job on the track, and if you're a rider that liked his airtime while you were riding these 480 machines, then when you did eventually make touchdown with Mother Earth once again, they did have a slight tendency to bottom out with a resounding thud. But as I said, in most race conditions, these forks were very good, albeit maybe a little on the soft side. And once again, the bike's old school stoppers up front were again decent brakes for 1983, and they were the twin leading shoe variety, of course, that had magnesium backplates. And as I remember, I'm pretty sure that the mountings for the actual brake shoes were also made of lightweight magnesium. Now, at the rear of our 480, we again had a single monoshock Showa unit, which was once more surprisingly good considering the suspension technologies of the early 1980s. But it did have plenty scope for adjustment And I think as I remember, it had 12 different compression settings, and I think it was about 20 rebound adjustments. So it certainly did give the rider a bit of leeway with regards setting it up. And of course, the remote gas and oil reservoir was also bolted onto the outside of the chassis just to try and help cool the internals of that suspension systems. And any minor adjustments that you needed to make to the shock settings could be done by just simply turning this little clicker knob on the outside of the unit. And also at the back of our big 480 we had Honda's well-proven Prolink rear suspension and swing arm combination, which was of course connected to that rear shock by way of a linkage that was bolted on to the swing arm. But this rear suspension system again worked extremely well in all manner of race conditions, and Honda are still using derivatives of this Prolink suspension system even on today's modern day motocrossers. Although some riders do say that these Prolink suspension systems weren't as good as Suzuki's full floater, which was always regarded as one of the best rear suspension systems of the 1980s. Now again, and as with many of the other motocross bike manufacturers of the 1980s, plastic was the material of choice when building off-road bikes because it was relatively cheap, it was very light, and of course easy to produce. But by 1983 almost everybody was using plastic to make fuel tanks and body panels for their off-roaders, and this Honda 480 tank usually held just over 2 gallons of fuel, which was normally enough to keep that big thirsty 480 fed with gas. Now the 1983 480 Honda was of course fitted with this Lazy Boy racing seat, which at the time was said to be one of the most comfortable places for your backside on any Evolution crosser of that year, and it also had this up on the tank type of configuration, which of course allowed the rider plenty room to shift his weight from the back to the front of the bike to help it make sharper turns into corners. But if you were sitting perched on top of the tank, you certainly had to watch that you didn't damage those precious crown jewels if you hit a large bump in the racetrack. Now, up at the cockpit end of our 480, we have a pair of rental handlebars, which of course replaced the original Honda stock items from the factory. And on the clutch side, a decent quality lever here and its dust cover, and also a very important engine kill switch as well, because if that big 480 engine has a problem and decides to head for the moon at full throttle, then you'd certainly want to be able to shut it down before you deploy your parachute. But I have to say, you're a very brave and exceptional human being if you can hold this gasser throttle wide open in top gear on this bike, and it's only the completely insane pilots who even try it. And as I said previously, Danny Magoo Chandler was one such person who could boss one of these 480 ballistic missiles. Although you certainly have to admit that in 1983 Honda made big improvements over the previous 1982 480, because although they still kept basically the same size of motor as the 82 bike, nearly everything else was either modified or replaced for the following year. And the bodywork was also new. The suspension on the front and rear was brand new, and virtually everything else was made much better over the previous 82 480. And as I said, without question, Honda certainly got just about everything spot on with this 1983 480 two-stroker, and even in this modern day with the right rider on board, these bikes are still highly competitive even against more modern machinery, and that's another reason that they're very much sought after by collectors and riders who race in the big bike 500 Evolution class. Now, as yet, our bike's new owner Eric Bracewell hasn't really decided if he wants to put the bike back on the track again, or maybe even just keep it as a collector's piece. But one thing's for sure, Eric's certainly got himself a hold of one of the very best and most iconic motocross machines of 1983. So there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that walk around Eric Bracewell's quite nice looking CR480 Honda from 1983, an absolute legend of a two-stroke motocross machine from the early 1980s. Now, as I said, we do have some more racing and plenty classic dirt bikes for you to take a look at here on my channel in the coming weeks and months. So if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, then I do hope you will take a minute to do that very small thing in order that you don't miss out on any of the future videos that I post. So coming up next here on my channel, we're going to take a look at a European motocross machine that was very popular during the early 1970s and even more popular over there in the USA. And we're going to take a look at this lovely 1974 360 Bultaco Pursang. Now, this particular bike here, it belongs to Scottish rider Derek Fald, and Derek managed to win the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Championship on this bike in 2017. So we'll take a look at Derek's lovely Bultaco when we return here to Classic Dirt Bike TV. So until the next time, everybody out there, continue to watch what you're doing when you're riding those old vintage race bikes, and I hope I can see you back here again very soon so we can show you more of those old school vintage race bikes right here on your #1 and favourite Classic Dirt Bike TV channel.